Hello and welcome to this podcast from the BBC World Service. Please let us know what you think and tell other people about us on social media. Podcasts from the BBC World Service are supported by advertising.
Hello, this is John Grills from Creepy. Want to see something scary? Shudder is the ultimate streaming service for fans of horror, thrillers, and the supernatural. Brought to you by AMC Networks. Shudder is a premium streaming service that promises its members a multi-sensory dive into fantastical worlds. All uncut and commercial-free. Discover films and series that cover the entire horror spectrum, including highly anticipated new releases like The Boy Behind the Door, and one of my new favorite movies, Psycho Gorman. Available ad-free, on demand, and through the platforms you're already on. Shudder. So good, it's scary. Sign up at shudder.com. That's SHUDDER.
Hello and welcome to News Hour from the BBC World Service, coming to you live from our studios in central London. I'm Julian Marshall. The US military are due to pull out of Kabul airport in a matter of hours, ending their 20-year presence in Afghanistan and ending emergency evacuation flights by Western governments for those civilians fleeing the Taliban. US forces are now focused primarily on flying out themselves and their remaining diplomats under the threat of further violence. The US says its anti-missile system intercepted 5 rockets fired towards the airport earlier today. The Afghan affiliate of Islamic State say they fired the rockets. The group has also said it carried out a bomb and gun attack at the airport last week, which left up to 170 people dead. But a preemptive US drone strike in Kabul on Sunday against suspected suicide bombers seems to have gone badly wrong. The Pentagon says it's investigating reports that suggest that 10 civilians were killed in the strike, all members of the same family. Ramin Yousefi, who's in Kabul, told the BBC his cousin and 6 of his cousin's children all died.
We lost about 10 members of our family. I have a question from the United States. How a person who works, who has jobs, charity organization, how it can be a part of a Daesh? All of 10 members of a family, they are killed in this attack, all civilian people, all the children. They work in the civilian field. They do not, army, they do not suicide attack. We gathered our price of our members and with our hands. How it's possible? We see the hell in our living. They should respond to our question. Why they killed our family, our children, 7 children, that they all are burned out. We cannot identify his face, his body.
Well, the United States continues to insist that it successfully targeted a vehicle to prevent another attack on Kabul airport by Islamic State militants. But speaking of the daily briefing in Washington, Army General William Hank Taylor admitted that the strike did spark a number of secondary explosions.
On Sunday, U.S. military forces conducted an unmanned over-the-horizon airstrike on a vehicle known to be an imminent ISIS-K threat. This self-defense strike successfully hit the target near Kabul airport. Significant secondary explosions from the targeted vehicle indicated the presence of a substantial amount of explosive material.
Well, Abi Boulos is the LA Times correspondent in Kabul, and he visited the scene of the apparent drone strike.
This was a working-class neighborhood not far from the airport. And I mean, you're talking about basically what is, a collection of squat buildings. Nothing is very tall there. And the street has a trench running through it as a sort of gutter. And there, on one of these streets, you find this family compound, which is, like a few rooms, it's 2 stories, and there's a driveway. And inside the driveway, there are 2 cars. One is an SUV, and the other one is, I guess, the car that was targeted, which was a white Corolla, as far as I can tell. And I say as far as I can tell because it was basically disintegrated. It had been blown up, and you could see that. You could see that a missile had basically slammed somewhere on the side of the passenger. and then it detonated. And basically the car had just blown up in the sense that, there was nothing left of the roof. You saw melted plastic, the tires, the suspension, etc. You could tell there were parts of a car, but they were all scrambled up. And of course, you could also see bits of, I don't try to say that, but you could see bits of flesh as well.
As far as you could tell, the damage to the vehicle was consistent with a missile strike?
I'm no expert, so I cannot claim to be, but it was certainly some kind of an ordnance because you could see a hole where this projectile had struck. And it must have been explosive because you could see the burn marks throughout.
Because the Pentagon is now talking in terms of secondary explosions, and I just wondered whether you saw any evidence of those.
Well, I must admit I didn't. But again, I cannot claim to be a ballistic expert, so I don't want to sort of second guess because I don't know. With that being said, I saw no evidence of what was called a secondary explosion, to be honest with you.
Did relatives and neighbours tell you anything about what happened?
They told us they only heard one explosion, that it was, a big boom. And then basically one of the guys who was in the house actually was disoriented. And then, of course, they realized that so many of these family members were killed. But essentially, we're talking about 10 people, including about 7 children. The youngest was 1.5 years old. And
I understand that at least one of those killed was understood to have a U.S. visa to leave the country. Is that so?
Well, my understanding was that the fellow who had actually, the one who was driving the car, Zimari Ahmadi, he actually had an application for what's known as a P2, a priority designation. I don't think he managed to get it yet. And his brother had an SIV, a special immigrant visa.
So you're saying that some of those killed were in the car, but they appear to have been civilians. Is that right, rather than combatants?
It seems all of them were civilians. I mean, to be clear, these are people who were basically working with the government. And I must say, no one said that they had shown any kind of affiliation with ISIS. I talked to neighbors, I talked to relatives, I talked to the family. They were all, frankly, amazed that they had been targeted because they had been considered to be a target for the Taliban, if anything.
What about at the funeral, which you attended today, the funerals? How would you describe the mood there?
Furious. And of course, very, very, very sad. You're talking about a situation where, you had, I hate to say it this way, but it was basically 7 short coffins and 3 long ones. And, the crowd that was there, it was about maybe, it was over 100 people. It could possibly have been 200. They were, of course, furious, and many of them were crying. It was a terrible scene. You're talking about people who are just plain civilians, nothing special about them in terms of any kind of military prowess or anything like that.
So you're talking about possibly a group of people who have been aligned with the US-backed Afghan government, now just pleased to see them go.
Well, to be clear, I think all of them at this point are pleased to see them go. I mean, these people are furious with America is what it amounts to. They had signs saying that they were a criminal country, one that was a killer of Muslims like them. It was really amazing to see just because these people had been, they were just civilians is what it amounts to. And suddenly their lives had been upended because of a missile. Now, again, it's worth noting, and this is important to say, that, the Pentagon statement had come out at the same time as another report of a mortar hitting that neighborhood. So, I don't want to sort of get ahead of myself and say that for sure it's the U.S. drone strike. But I have to say most indications say that it is. And if so, that is a massive mistake.
Nabi Boulos, the LA Times correspondent in Kabul. There are no precise figures for those Afghans who worked with the United States and its allies and who were eligible for the evacuation flights but had been left behind, but it's estimated to be in the thousands. And then there are those who worked with or for U.S. institutions in Afghanistan, such as the American University of Afghanistan in Kabul, who might have expected to be evacuated. Professor Michael Barry taught at the university until last year when he was forced to leave because of the COVID pandemic and teach remotely. We brought him together with one of his students, whom we're not naming because he's still in Afghanistan. Professor Barry told me that the staff and students who haven't been able to get out have been abandoned by the United States.
Quite clearly, the American embassy waived all moral, ethical responsibility. The American University of Afghanistan was founded in 2006, essentially by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. It was an extension of American policy, and very frankly, it was a piece of nation building which advertised itself as a way of educating tomorrow's Afghan elite through the standards set by an American educational system. As soon as President Biden announced his intention of withdrawing American forces from Afghanistan, the American embassy in Afghanistan did absolutely nothing, and I mean nothing, to ensure that the staff, premises, goods, and especially students of the university would be placed in a position of safety, evacuated, every precaution taken after more than a decade of advertising that these students were supposed to be the prime example of the very best that America could do in the country. And I know that I am speaking on behalf of the entire faculty, both international and national, in denouncing this moral disgrace.
Could I bring in a student now? And are you wanting to leave Afghanistan?
Definitely. Every student and every single individual in this country wants to leave the country. The problem is that students were exposed to danger and the United States left them alone on the ground and left to the devices of their own fate. The university was already attacked in 2016 and still considered to be a place where people corrupt Islam.
Are the Taliban on the campus? Are they at the university?
Yes, they are now controlling it.
So they're actually staying there, they're sleeping on the university campus?
Yes.
What future do you see for yourself in Afghanistan?
People, be the students or normal people living the country, they have realized that they don't have any future, and it is very clear and it is very obvious.
Professor, I understand that some of the students have had their names shared with the Taliban. Is that correct?
The university is very keen to insist that this was a false rumor and that no information was shared with the Taliban, at least not anything that the university did. However, I would like to bear witness to what I would call the little staff, the humble staff, the gardeners, the cooks, the maids, who are in terror of their lives and who in their humble quarters of Kabul are designated, pointed by the finger, as people who were able to earn American salaries, rather low, but still rather decent by ordinary Afghan standards, and who are now threatened by their neighbors with possible denunciation, whereby neighbors are saying, you were able to get so much money working for the Americans for a decade or more. Well, the Americans are gone. They're not going to help you anymore. And you had better give us so much money that you earned. Maybe give us your garden, give us your house, or otherwise we will denounce you to the Taliban. In other words, we're beginning to see the grim atmosphere, say, of France under Nazi occupation, where a tyrannical government makes possible local settling of scores, petty hatreds, and use of fear and blackmail.
That was Professor Michael Barry from the American University of Afghanistan. He was speaking to me from Paris. We also heard from one of his students in Afghanistan. He was speaking from Kabul. We tried to contact the US Embassy in Kabul for a response to the charges levelled against it, but it was very late in the evening by then, and we've not yet had a reply. You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is News Hour. Still to come, with COVID cases rising quickly in Japan at the same time as the Paralympic Games are taking place in Tokyo, our correspondent speaks to a local doctor.
So I asked the doctor, what happens if there's a COVID outbreak at the Paralympics?
Yeah, I think there are no room to treat the Paralympic members because the many Japanese people cannot get into the hospital. So please be careful.
That report in full in about 20 minutes' time. The latest headlines from the BBC Newsroom. The UN Security Council has adopted a resolution calling on the Taliban to allow Afghans and foreign nationals safe passage out of Afghanistan. And the Pentagon says it can't yet dispute claims that an American drone strike on a suspected suicide bomber killed a number of civilians in Kabul. This is Julian Marshall with NewsHour live from the BBC in London. The United Nations is warning that a hunger crisis in Madagascar is on the verge of becoming the world's first famine caused by climate change. 4 years of drought in southern Madagascar have left some communities facing catastrophic conditions. But while similar crises in places like Yemen, Somalia and Ethiopia have been blamed on conflict, the situation on this giant island off the east coast of Africa is in part, according to experts, due to global warming. Our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding reports.
In the pale, dry hills of southern Madagascar, a hungry family sits in the dust. We eat insects now, says Tamaria, a mother of 4, holding a few dried locusts in a bowl. But we have no water to clean them, she says, and no rain to harvest what we've sown in the fields. And so, the grimly familiar scenes of listless children with desperately thin arms and distended stomachs. We scavenge for cactus leaves, says Bole. That's all we do now. Her husband died of hunger. So did a neighbour who left her with 2 more children to feed. It's not much better in the towns.
So many children start to beg in the street of Fort-Dauphin, that asking for small money, for small change, to buy food.
Tina Endor runs a small charitable organisation, Seed. The worst drought in 40 years has left Madagascar reeling.
In the past, we know when the rain will come, when people start to grow crops and when the harvesting time will be. But now at this time, the 4th season of the year is not known. When you go at the market, you see less and less. Things is disappearing off from the market.
This region has endured droughts before, but this one is different. In fact, it may be unique. The United Nations is now warning that Madagascar is on the brink of the world's first climate change famine.
Hundreds of thousands of lives are at risk in Madagascar, and it's the first time we're seeing people at risk on the verge of starvation because of climate change.
Shelley Thackrell works for the UN's World Food Programme.
These are famine-like conditions, and they've been driven by climate, not conflict. And these people have done nothing to contribute to climate change.
Some help is arriving now in remote villages like this one, but not enough. Not after 4 years without rain. No wonder the experts are sounding so worried.
I'm Ronchtina Barmalala. I'm a climate scientist based at the University of Cape Town, the Department of Oceanography, and I'm originally from Madagascar. If climate change continues, we do expect to have more drought and more agricultural drought and ecological drought over the country.
So when we see these pictures of children starving, when we hear reports of the hunger in southern Madagascar, in a way this is a direct warning signal about climate change.
I would say yes, it's really part of it.
In southern Madagascar, a sense of desperation is taking hold.
When I tried to grow cassava this year, it was stolen.
Lomba Hasoavana has been camping in his field at night, trying to protect his crops from thieves, but it's become too dangerous.
You could risk your life if you do that. It's too dangerous to do that as well. I find it scary for the future.
And so, from a remote corner of an isolated island, an alarming precedent, as climate change pushes Madagascar towards famine.
Our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding reporting. No one is safe until everyone's safe has been the mantra of the World Health Organization as it pushed for more COVID vaccinations to be made available to low-income countries. But the WHO now finds itself berating Europe for the slowness of its vaccination programmes. Its Europe Director Hans Klug says the resulting increase in infections could lead to an extra 230,000 deaths by December. Mr. Klug also controversially defended plans for booster shots in Europe, which runs contrary to the previous stance of the WHO that extra shots for the fully protected could deprive the unvaccinated. He told me about his concerns.
From the last week, we have an 11% increase in deaths, and in 33 out of 53 countries, there is a steep increase in what we call 14-day incidence. And of course, this is to do with the fact that we have a much more transmissible Delta variant, with the seasonal mobility during the leave, and also countries are really opening up. So we have to drastically scale up the vaccination uptake, and there we have an issue as well, because we see that we have now a plateauing in several countries of vaccination uptake, including due to vaccine hesitancy.
So you are saying that slow uptake is a combination perhaps of the slowness of rollout of the vaccine plus vaccine hesitancy?
Exactly.
Could you name countries?
It's both within the European Union and outside of the European Union in the larger region. If we speak about issues of lack of access, as an issue in the Caucasus, in Central Asia in particularly, and that's why really countries with a surplus, those countries to be more active still on sharing vaccines and not wait till the last moment that then we have an issue with the expiry date, but really proactively sharing the vaccines, because no one is safe until everyone is safe.
So you're talking now about sharing vaccines within Europe, that there are some countries that have more than they need. There are some countries that don't have enough.
Absolutely. For example, in the European Union, there is a huge excess surplus, and those vaccines are going to expire. And this is starting. So I want to be positive, but the rate is too slow. The pace is too slow.
You predicted that Europe could see more than 230,000 further deaths from COVID-19 by December. What needs to happen to reduce that figure?
A quicker and more equitable vaccine rollout, but also seriously look into additional jabs to protect the vulnerable people, like a kind of a third dose, while still people who haven't had the first dose should get one.
Could I ask you, though, about that controversial request for booster shots? And I say controversial because the WHO has previously said that topping up fully protected people would deprive the unvaccinated. And one of your colleagues, Mike Ryan, has likened it to handing out extra life jackets to those who already have them and leaving the rest to drown.
Right. So Mike Ryan is absolutely correct. The top priority globally is to ensure, particularly healthcare workers, elderly people, people who are immunocompromised, get their full series. At the same time, there is emerging data who show that immunocompromised people should receive a third dose if they did not respond sufficiently to the initial doses, or if they are no longer producing antibodies, and such groups would be exempt from the booster moratorium. The key issue here, I want to stress, is do it all. So it's not that a third dose should be seen as taking away a life jacket from someone who is drowning. No, we have to do it all. There are surplus of vaccines, those need to be shared. And at the same time, we do have to build the evidence around the additional jabs.
That's the World Health Organization's Europe Director, Hans Klug.
Now to a shocking corruption scandal in Baltimore.
Their oath is to protect and serve.
He pulled me over with some dumb excuse, handcuffed me, searched the car. I was robbed by Baltimore City police, armed robbery.
But what happens when cops don't protect your home, but invade it?
I heard my daughter screaming. I jumped out of my bed. I took maybe 1 to 2 steps. Cop had a gun pointed in my face.
and the only thing they serve is their own self-interest.
It was just an abundance of narcotics, things that weren't making it to the evidence room.
When drug dealers collude with law enforcement. Bad Cops, from the BBC World Service.
Altogether, it's around $1.75 million in drugs and cash.
Search for Bad Cops wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to NewsHour, and in a moment we'll be asking if Hurricane Ida, now battering the U.S. state of Louisiana, is another extreme weather event caused by man-made climate change. But first... Ariana Saeed is known as Afghanistan's Madonna. The Afghan musician and talent show judge is also an activist for women's rights and has championed the freedom of dress code in the country. So the singer, who's been critical of the Taliban, knew she had to flee as they were moving in to take control of Kabul. She told the BBC about her escape.
Because of the fact that I've been a target for many years now, we had to try to just escape. The day that we had our flight, it was supposed to be at 8 p.m. This is on the 15th of August. And Taliban were not actually inside Kabul yet. We were just waiting to be checked in for a few hours. And then suddenly at around 5, 6 o'clock, we hear gunshots. So as a result of which everybody got scared, and the entire airport staff plus the security, they disappeared. They left the airport entirely to public. So my fiance and I, somehow we get into the plane. And then I look around and I see like a plane that's for a capacity of maximum 200-300 people is filled up with like at least 1,000 people piled up on top of each other, children, babies crying and screaming. And there's absolutely no oxygen and no air to breathe and no space. So I decided to leave the plane and I got off. Obviously, there was no pilots either because the pilots were scared and they had run away as well. Despite the fact that the plane was filled with thousands of people, there were people on board with guns on them. They were armed. And then the next day, we heard that there's another gate in the other side of the airport where there's the American base. So if we somehow manage to get to the base, then we'll be able to take one of the military flights. There was a woman like next to me, and she was saying she was an American citizen, but unfortunately she didn't have her passport with her. And she had a little baby. And both of us, we get close to the gate and then she hands me the baby and she's like, "Can you take my baby with you?" It was so heartbreaking for me because I didn't know what to do. I was thinking, if I take the baby with me, if she cannot make it, how can I separate the baby from her mother? It was a very hard moment for me to think straight on what to do. I'm sitting here thinking, my heart is just broken and I'm just thinking about the people who are left behind and they have nowhere to go.
And that was Ariana Saeed talking to the BBC after she escaped Kabul on a US military plane. And the chief of the US Central Command, Ken McKenzie, has just announced that the US military has completed withdrawal of its forces from Afghanistan. That's after a period of 20 years. Hopefully more on that before the end of the programme. You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Marshall and this is NewsHour. Hundreds of rescue teams are using boats and planes to search for people trapped by rising floodwaters in the wake of Hurricane Ida, one of the most powerful to hit land in the southern United States. Forecasters have warned of storm surges along the coasts of Louisiana and Mississippi. At least one person is known to have died. But the governor of Louisiana, John Bel Edwards, has said he expects the number of deaths to rise as the extent of the damage becomes clearer. While Ida has weakened, virtually no one in Louisiana, including the entire city of New Orleans, has power and communications are difficult. In a message to the residents, Governor Edwards described the situation in one part of the state.
Virtually no one has electricity in this part of our state right now. We have water systems that are out. We have tremendous damage to homes and to businesses. We know that individuals are out there waiting to be rescued because their homes are not habitable. Many places we have floodwaters that are encroaching upon those homes. Please know that we have thousands of people out right now with high water vehicles and boats who are doing search and rescue. We have dozens of helicopters up, and that's just from the state side.
Well, our correspondent Nada Taufik has been to one of the worst affected areas.
All across southern Louisiana, the painful task of surveying the damage from Hurricane Ida is underway. The destruction is immense and the situation for some is desperate. In Jefferson Parish, the rising waters and intense winds left communities in tatters. Clarence has lived here for 50 years and says this is the worst storm he's experienced.
It's terrifying. I mean, we're in the bedroom and it started leaking, and then we come out the bedroom and go into another room and start leaking in that room. And then finally we came into the living room and the dining room here, and this was the only room where it didn't really leak. It leaked, but it didn't leak that bad where the sheetrock fell in.
Without proper shelter, power, or water, he has no choice but to leave. His dilemma now, where to go. Ida strengthened so rapidly that it gave people very little time to prepare or evacuate. For those who stayed, it has been a difficult night and an even harder morning. Along the roads, closed and impassable in many areas, we found a family walking to find food. The storm's strong winds ripped their trailer apart in the middle of the night. They took shelter at a neighbor's house.
I ain't got nothing left. House is gone. Car is gone. Sorry.
Ida has taken so much from this region, one that is already battling another COVID outbreak. Recovery will surely be long and difficult.
Nada Taufik reporting. Well, 2021 has been marked by extreme weather events blamed by many scientists on man-made climate change. It's a long list, but to mention just a few: devastating floods in Germany, Belgium and central China, a suffocating heatwave in the Pacific Northwest, wildfires burning out of control in Greece, Turkey and Algeria, and drought in Madagascar, as we heard earlier in the programme. So is Hurricane Ida the result of climate change or simply an exceptionally ferocious storm in what is, after all, the Atlantic hurricane season? So which is it? Kerry Emanuel is an atmospheric scientist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He studies the physics of hurricanes and their connection to the climate.
Well, it's impossible to say about any particular event how much of it really had to do with climate change. What we can say is that Ida is typical of the kinds of storms, unfortunately, we expect to see more of, that intensify very rapidly and don't give forecasters enough time to notify authorities to conduct evacuations.
So why has it developed so quickly?
Well, as the climate warms, the potential for storms to intensify rapidly goes up quite quickly, and they can achieve higher intensities.
But you've just said it, as the climate warms.
Yes, indeed. That does contribute to it. Now, there's an awful lot of variability from one storm to the next. We see rapidly intensifying storms. We've seen those in the past. We'll see them in the future. It's a question of the statistics of them. What we're seeing is more instances of rapid intensification.
Okay, so let's just go back to basics for a moment and explain how a hurricane forms.
Well, the most important thing, I think, to understand about hurricanes is they're powered by the transfer of heat from the ocean to the atmosphere, and that happens when water evaporates from the surface of the ocean. As you put more greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, the potential rate of evaporation goes up to counter the greenhouse gas effect, if you will. And so storms can become more intense and they can intensify faster. It doesn't mean that all storms will do that, but it means that potentially they can do it faster than they used to be able to do it.
I mean, why are you not categorically saying that this is a result of climate change?
Well, it's a bit like saying that, your grandmother smoked 2 packs a day and sure enough, she died of lung cancer. Well, we know there's a strong connection between lung cancer and smoking, but there are people who die of lung cancer who never smoked and people who smoke a lot who don't die of lung cancer. So we can't categorically blame every single event on something, even when there is a strong statistical signal.
But I'm told that this is the strongest hurricane to hit Louisiana in, 150 years?
Well, it's tied for the strongest, but one has to be careful because, much more than 50 or 60 years ago, we had a hard time measuring these storms, even at landfall. So we don't know for sure how intense they were, but we have seen records broken all around the world for tropical cyclone intensity and for intensification rate and for longevity at high intensity. And so the cards are lining up. But we're dealing with a risk here. We can't afford to wait to be 95% certain that this is all what we expected to happen from climate warming. But it's consistent. We've had theory for the last 30 years that predicted that storms would become more intense. We see them becoming more intense. Are we 95% confident? No. Do we need to be to assert that we're taking a gamble? Absolutely not. We are taking such a gamble, and we need to factor that into our decisions.
But very briefly, you are 100% certain that there will be more of a similar intensity?
Yes, I think we'll see more records broken going forward.
Kerry Emanuel, an atmospheric scientist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Japan's worst COVID outbreak yet has shown how the country's otherwise highly regarded medical system is unable to cope with emergencies. There are now more than 10,000 seriously ill people waiting for hospital beds and another 25,000 who've been told they must recuperate at home. 21 COVID patients are reported to have died at home since the beginning of August. Our Tokyo correspondent Rupert Wingfield-Hayes has been travelling with a medical team in the south of the city as they fight to keep COVID-19 patients alive and try to find them hospital beds.
He is suffering from the shortness of breath, high fever, and fatigue.
32-year-old Dr. Kazuma Tashiro is on the front lines of Tokyo's battle with COVID-19. From his office in the south of the city, we're heading out to visit COVID patients who should be in hospital but can't get a bed. I'm in a part of Tokyo now called Otaku. It's a very old, densely packed residential neighbourhood, and we're just following Dr. Tashiro down a narrow alleyway here. One of his patients lives at the end of this alleyway. He'd been trying to call him this morning, and he hasn't been able to get through. He's very worried about him.
So the last night, I called him to check if he was alive. He could talk with me at the time. But this morning, I couldn't talk with him by phone. So I'm very anxious for his healthy condition. So now I'm checking whether or not he is alive or not.
Okay. While I stay outside, Dr. Tashiro and his team go in. The man is alive. He's lying on a tatami mat and there are bags full of rubbish strewn across the tiny apartment floor. He says he hasn't been able to pay his telephone bill and so it's been cut off. When Dr. Tashiro checks his blood oxygen level, it is dangerously low.
He didn't use an oxygen mask, but his blood oxygen level is only 92%. It is not good value, so I put the oxygen mask to his mouth. Right. And please keep it to protect your life.
And what's going to happen now about his bill?
This is a telephone bill.
Yeah.
He is living alone, so he couldn't pay the telephone bill because of his very bad condition. So I'm going to the convenience store to pay for it.
Right, so you're not just doctor, you're also like social services.
Yes.
We return to Dr. Tashiro's office for a quick break. At their desks, another team are constantly working the phones, trying to find hospital beds. Across Tokyo, there are now more than 10,000 COVID patients waiting to get into hospital. So I asked the doctor, what happens if there's a COVID outbreak at the Paralympics?
If there was a cluster in the Paralympic village, what happens to these people? Is there space?
Yeah, I think there are no room to treat the Paralympic members because the many Japanese people cannot get into the hospital. So please be careful.
So now we've moved on to another neighbourhood up on top of the hill here. It's a different case, a 54-year-old man. And he was fine. He seemed to be getting better. But his situation then turned for the worse a few days ago. And he can't get into hospital. And, once again, this is another person who hasn't been able to get vaccinated.
熱は
Inside, the man again is lying on the floor. He's in bad condition. His lips are blue and he's having difficulty breathing. Dr. Tashiro takes out his stethoscope and listens to his chest. He thinks the man is developing pneumonia. He really needs to get to hospital.
It is very difficult for us to make a definite diagnosis, so I called the health official to arrange him to hospital.
So he needs to go to hospital now?
Yes.
And
definitely.
What did they say?
No bed.
Standing in the street, Dr. Tashiro and his team remove another set of protective clothing and begin to disinfect. They repeat this routine now many times a day. They are keeping people here alive, but each day a sick patient is unable to get to hospital, the more likely they are to die.
The BBC's Rupert Wingfield-Hayes reporting from Tokyo. And since we've been on air, the US military says it's completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan after a mission lasting nearly 20 years. General Frank McKenzie, who's overseen the pullout, said the US had evacuated nearly 80,000 civilians from Kabul in the past few weeks. In fact, General McKenzie said the last Americans departed Kabul about 12 hours ago, and the news agencies are reporting from Kabul the sound of gunfire across the city, celebratory gunfire from several well-known Taliban checkpoints, as well as the cheers of fighters manning security posts in what was the Green Zone. A reminder of what has become our top story this hour. The US military has just announced that it's completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan. The Pentagon earlier said it couldn't dispute claims that an American drone strike on a suspected suicide bomber in Afghanistan killed a number of civilians. NewsHour spoke to Nabi Boulos, correspondent with the Los Angeles Times, who spoke to family members of those killed.
It seems all of them were civilians. I mean, to be clear, these are people who were basically working with the government. And I must say, no one said that they had shown any kind of affiliation with ISIS. I talked to neighbors, I talked to relatives, I talked to the family. They were all, frankly, amazed that they had been targeted because they had been considered to be a target for the Taliban, if anything.
Also this hour, the former First Lady of Rwanda, Agathe Kangiza, has lost a court bid in France to stop a judicial investigation into her alleged role in the 1994 genocide. You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Marshall, and this is NewsHour. For some Afghans, the journey to escape the Taliban through Kabul airport has been a lot longer and more perilous than for others. The distance from the city of Herat in the far west of the country to Kabul is more than 800 kilometres, but it was a journey that a resident of Herat, who we're not naming for his own safety and that of his family, made early this month when the city fell to the Taliban. He managed to get out on a plane from Kabul, is now in the US state of Texas. I asked him first to describe the day that Herat was captured on the 12th of August.
The day when the Herat was fall down to the Taliban's hands, it was really awful. I mean, in that day, there was no fight actually in the city as we saw. I mean, that somehow it was sold to the Taliban instead of fighting. The military didn't fight, and only the resident soldiers who were under the order of Amir Ismail Khan were trying to fight against the Taliban.
Couldn't you have stayed in Afghanistan, though? The Taliban say they don't want people to leave. They need people like you in the country.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point that they are saying, that they need people like me. They need educated people. They need experienced people. But the history has shown us that we cannot rely or believe on Taliban. What are they saying? There are many stories that the Taliban have already said that we are not going to do anything with the people who have worked with the government or non-governmental organizations. But actually, they have attacked to some houses. They have kidnapped some people in Herat and other cities. So as a person, as a student, as an activist who has worked with non-governmental organizations, I couldn't believe or rely on what Taliban were saying to us.
By the time you reached Kabul, had it been taken by the Taliban?
Yeah, it was taken by the Taliban. So we were forced to hidden our identity and who we were actually.
So you had your visa to get out of Afghanistan to another country, and
yeah, exactly.
So you headed to the airport.
Yeah.
And how was that?
That was horrible. Believe it or not, we were there for 2 days, and it was really difficult to get into the airport. But fortunately, we did it.
And you managed to get on an aeroplane. Was that luck, do you think, or did you have connections?
Believe me or not, yes. I believe that there was a luck as well, because as I know, there were many other people who had approved documentations, for example, SIV's people or P2s who have visa for America, but they couldn't do that. They couldn't take it. So I think we were lucky.
So what was it like once you got on that plane and it lifted off from Kabul?
We didn't know what will happen. You know, we were really embarrassed. We were on the plane, but the only thing which made us happy was that, okay, we are out of the danger, that the Taliban cannot reach us after this. So the feeling was, I cannot express it in words, but I think it was good.
And your first stop was Germany, is that right?
Yeah, Doha and then Germany.
And how long were you in Germany for?
In Germany, we were about, 1 day or near to 24 hours, and that's it.
And then on to the United States. How was that journey?
In the United States, it was much better because we traveled here by commercial, yeah. So we traveled to the Washington, D.C. and then towards Texas.
So you're now in Texas. Where exactly are you in Texas?
Yeah, we are in a camp. They call it El Paso in Texas. There are many people here.
I mean, a couple of months ago, you were in Herat. You did have plans. Okay, the Taliban were conducting an offensive. They were getting close to Herat. But I can't imagine that 2 months on, you thought you'd be sitting in a resettlement camp in El Paso in
exactly.
Texas.
That's the point. I was a senior student of law and political science. I planned to apply for Chevening scholarship or Fulbright scholarship. But just in 2 months, they destroyed everything. You know, my future has been destroyed by them. So I couldn't live under the control of them. You know, even if they just say that, okay, we will forgive all of you, there is no problem with you, you can work. But how can I forgive them? The point is here. They destroyed my future. They destroyed my house, my people, everything. So how can I work or be with them?
It's a question that's often asked of those US soldiers who served in Afghanistan over the past 20 years. Was it worth it? And what do you feel? Were 20 years of US and Western attempts to develop Afghanistan, were they worth it now that the Taliban are back in control?
You know, I really appreciate all the works, all the things that the United States, the other governments, other Western governments have done for the Afghanistan. They have tried their best. They did their best. But actually now all of their achievements, I think as a person, as a citizen of Afghanistan at least, I think they all have gone.
That was a resident of the western Afghan city of Herat who has successfully made it to the US state of Texas after flying out of Kabul airport. And indeed, in the past half an hour, the US military has announced that it's completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan. General Kenneth Frank McKenzie, who's overseen the pullout, said the US had evacuated nearly 80,000 civilians from Kabul in the past few weeks.
I'm here to announce the completion of our withdrawal from Afghanistan and the end of the military mission to evacuate American citizens, third country nationals, and vulnerable Afghans. The last C-17 lifted off from Hamid Karzai International Airport on August 30th this afternoon at 3:29 p.m. East Coast time. and the last manned aircraft is now clearing the airspace above Afghanistan.
General McKenzie added that the Taliban had been helpful and useful to the US as the military closed down its Afghan operations. When NewsHour's Lise Doucette is in Kabul, where Taliban forces have been firing their weapons into the air in celebration.
Well, listen. The guns are going off. The streams of red lights behind me, the tracer fire going up in the night sky. All day we had heard the American warplanes circling above the city, flying low as we thought the last American flights were taking off, providing extra cover in these last decisive hours. But it's now the 31st of August in Afghanistan, the day that President Joe Biden said the American military mission, the 20-year engagement by US-led NATO forces, would formally end.
Lise Doucette ending this edition of NewsHour.
NewsHour has been a download from the BBC. To discover more and our terms of use, visit bbc.com/podcasts.